Why, one might ask, did Africans resist to European conquest prove generally so ineffective? This question raises the whole problem of the nature of organizations of indigenous resistance to alien rule in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The colonial powers, especially the British and the French, sometimes attributed their easy success to what they describe as the isolation of West African rulers of the time. Convinced that such opponents as Oba Obarami of Benin and Samatore, Amadu Sekou, and the Fulani Ilarki in the northern Nigeria and so on were soulless living things who mercilessly grounded under their heels the overwhelming majority of the peoples. The colonial powers believed that the traditional rulers did not always enjoy the support of their own subjects in the wars of resistance to alien rule. In the light of this misconception, powers saw themselves as liberators of the oppressed peoples of West Africa. The majority of the inhabitants of this large town, Ijubu, wrote Sir Gilbert Carter before the Ijubu expedition of 1892, will welcome the advent of the British flag. In the same vein, Lagarde claimed that in 1902 that the misrule of the Fulani had rendered them so hateful to the bulk of the populations. Who would welcome their overthrow? On the overthrow of Canoe, he also claimed that the British troops entered the town unopposed by the common people who looked on as though the matters did not immediately concern them. No doubt paraphrasing the opinion of the French colonels and generals who conquered French West Africa. Raymond L. Bull wrote in 1927, when the French undertook the occupation of the West Africa, they were confronted with a number of native tyrants who cruelly exploited their subjects. Life and property were insecure. Slavery and human sacrifice prevailed everywhere. In a few cases, local almamis had imposed a form of discipline maintained by terrorism upon thousands of unwilling subjects. Thus, it can be fashionable to conclude that the feeble resistance of West African states to European rule was mainly due to the indifference of the masses to the fate of their rulers or even the willingness to accept new masters. This explanation of weakness of the resistant movement in West Africa is suspect for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was the interest of the local commoners to represent the small but costly wars in West Africa as wars of liberation, crusades for humanitarianism and civilizations, and adjusted military measures before the home governments and the parried criticisms by humanitarian societies in Europe. Secondly, there was contemporary European ignorance of the political organization and traditions of most West African people. West African rulers were portrayed as despots, but research has shown that their governments were more democratic than their hostile detractors knew of or would allow. In fact, some of the so-called autocratic chiefs were mere puppets of their councils, which in turn depended on the popular support of their powers and authority. And furthermore, the traditional military systems of West Africa rulers, with a few exceptions of such as the Samari Torre, depended wholly or mainly on the principle of general liability of all adult males to carry arms. Under this type of political military system, it was difficult for most West African rulers to impose unpopular war policies on the subjects. The trouble with the armies of resistance was not numbers but training and experience of arms. Thirdly, West African society was not as rigidly stratified as the European explanation implies. There was a distinction between free men and those of servile origins, but among free men there were no class distinctions so rigid as to hamper the pursuit of common political goals and unified military actions. With a few exceptions here and there, for instance, of the West Atlantic coast, there was no class stigma to hamper social mobility indefinitely. Now, this was true even in northern Nigeria, which would seem to provide a classical example of such rigid social stratification between the Fulani and the Habib. The Telkwa were not necessarily all Habib. Some Fulani were commoners unless they were rich or held hereditary or appointive offices. Furthermore, miscegenation was already blurring the ethnic line between the conquered Fulani and the conquered Habib by the time of the colonial powers were threatening the independence of the Sokoto Caliph. Above all, the classical concept of Muslim community was that all members identified themselves with a struggle against a non-Muslim people. Division in the body politic could therefore hardly explain the weakness of the resistant movements, at least in the case of the Muslim communities. Moreover, this unusual explanation for easy European success misrepresents the attitudes of different groups in West Africa to the pre-colonial order. To the Europeans, the political, economic, and cultural situation in West Africa at the time of the scramble and after depicted nothing but squalor, chaos, and barbarism, which African masses were anxious to give up. But this was the Europeans' view of African society, not the Africans. Though some of the masses might have had grievances against the established order, they could hardly have questioned the fundamental basis of society. If they expected change, it was within the context of what they knew. They were not in a position to say whether the colonial regime, which they had not yet experienced, would make their situation better or worse. Baba and Koro is supposed to have given the Habib reason for welcoming the Europeans as a fact that if you worked for them, they paid you for it. They did not say like the Fulani, "Come to give me this, come to bring me that." This story was certainly a latter-day myth. In 1900, the Habib had no way of knowing that the Europeans would be better taskmasters than the Fulani. The ultimate explanation of ineffectiveness of West African resistance to colonial conquest lay in the superiority of the colonial armies in arms, experience, and strategy, as well as in the fact that the time of the wars of independent West Africa was in political diplomatic disarray. The armies of resistance, even those commanded by Samora Touré, were, compared with the armies of the colonial powers, poorly trained, poorly armed, poorly officered. Hilary Belcock's cynical observation, remember this, whatever happens, we have got the maximum gun, and they have not, was unfortunately true for West Africa.